In the last section, we took care of the case of our app first booting up when our Firebase library is deciding whether or not we are currently signed in or not. So I think the last thing we have to do is add some functionality to sign the user out whenever they click this log out button. We've already got a button tag in here, right here, and we know exactly how to add in some code to fire whenever the user presses this thing. Remember, we pass a prop of onPress to the button, and inside that onPress, we can pass a fat arrow function that will be ran whenever the user presses this thing. So I expect the button tag here to grow in size just a little bit, so I'm going to start by putting this thing on a new line, like so. And do make sure that you don't have a semicolon at the end of the button tag right here, otherwise you'll get a nice big error. Now we'll add on our onPress, and we'll pass it our event handler. So now inside of this fat arrow function, we have to figure out how to sign a user out. And not gonna lie, it's not the worst thing we have to do, not the worst thing in the world. All we have to do is call firebase.auth.signout with a capital O. And that's it. I think I'll do another new line here just to make things look nice. Okay, so now let's test the simulator. I'll refresh, and now when I click this button, I should be signing my user out. The instant I sign my user out, I'm going to expect that my authentication state is changing, which means logged in should be getting flipped over to false, and I should be shown the login form again. So let's see if that's the case. Let's see if that's how this works. I'll click log out, and ta-da, I see the login form. And now I should be able to enter in test@test.com, a password of password, and sign back in. There we go. And again, I can log right back out. Perfect. So that is it for authentication. That's the whole flow. Now, of course, we're missing a little bit of critical parts in here, right? Once you actually sign in, it would be great to have some more useful content on the screen. But for the purposes of this application, I just want to show you the general idea behind authentication with Firebase and how to handle form input. We will definitely in the future come back to authentication and figure out how to build more complex applications where a user can sign in and sign out. So one last thing I want to do is just do one last walkthrough of this entire application. So inside this application, we learned about Firebase to start. We used Firebase to create a new project on the Firebase console. We installed the local Firebase library, and then we initialized it using some amount of configuration. This configuration right here told Firebase that we want to connect to a very specific project that we had created. After that, we learned about handling text input inside of our login form. And this is where things were pretty strange. Remember the interesting of the flow. We used our state object to tell our input what its value should be. So we were not at any point in time really kind of, pulling the value out of the input. At all points in time, we were telling the input, hey, this is what your value currently is. And this is at great odds with how a lot of other JavaScript frameworks work. Normally, you'll just let a user type in the input, and then at some point in time, like when the user tries to submit the form, you'll pull the value out of that input. So React handles this a little bit differently. Creating inputs like this is referred to as creating controlled components inside of React. So just a little bit of terminology there for you. Next, we learned how to use conditional rendering to render different stuff inside of our components. So we added a helper method called renderButton, and then inside of renderButton, we decided whether or not we wanted to show a spinner or a button, one or the other. This is a super common pattern for handling showing users different content on the screen. So as time goes on, we'll probably end up with more and more helper functions to decide what content we want to show to our user. Fourth, we created two new reusable components, both the input component and the spinner. These are fantastic little components. We're definitely going to reuse them again in the future, so try not to mess around with them too much. Finally, last thing we learned, and this is my favorite part of the app, we made sure to give the user a lot of feedback about the current state of the app that they were using. So by that, I mean that we were showing the user an error message, and we were showing them some nice spinners whenever we were making a request. So whenever we were making a request, if that's kind of like blocking the user experience, It's a really good use case to make sure that we show the user a nice spinner on the screen to kind of be like, hey, we acknowledge your action, but something's going on right now. Right now we're loading something or doing whatever. And while that's occurring, great practice to show a spinner to the user. All right, so this app was a lot of fun to build, and we've got a solid foundation now on the basics of React. Let's continue the next section where we're going to start getting a lot more familiar with Redux.